Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the first installment of our three-part digital workshop on tackling multi-tier supply chain challenges in a post-COVID world. Today's topic is about the importance of achieving end-to-end supply chain visibility. My name is Jared Daly, and I'll be the host and the moderator. Before we get started with the presentation, I would like to address a couple of administrative items. First, we have a very full agenda for today's session. As you'll see here, we have the agenda for today's session and indeed the following sessions. So what I would ask is that everybody remain on mute to minimize disruptions. I can always mute or expel users that are having excessive background noise, although I suspect there should be no problems there. Second, we may have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question for Trevor, please use the chat feature to type your messages directly to me, or if you feel comfortable, you can get on the mic at the end and ask your questions directly. Any questions that we are unable to get to on today's call, we will do our best to address via email afterwards. And then lastly, if you're attending the workshop to obtain credit hours towards your Institute of Supply Management, CPSM, or the Association for Supply Chain Management, CSCP, please send me a chat message or an email, and I would be happy to provide you with a certificate for completion after the third and final webinar on June 16th. All right, with no further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today, Supply Dynamics CEO Trevor Stansbury. Now, Trevor is a subject matter expert on the adoption of digital thread and predictive analytic solutions in distributed supply chain environments. He's the former director of purchasing at Honeywell, and over the last 20 years, he has pioneered digital transformation at some of the world's largest manufacturing companies in aerospace, heavy equipment, tactical vehicles, energy, and other industries. So with that, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Trevor.
Well, thanks, Jared. Hey, COVID-19 has provoked systemic shocks, the likes of which we've not seen in modern history. Pick an indicator of economic health, and with the exception of the stock market, the picture is pretty sobering. Economic output has plummeted. The Purchasing Managers Index is a summary of economic activity in the manufacturing sector, and a PMI above 50 generally indicates an overall expansion, whereas a PMI below 50 indicates that the market's shrinking. The PMI is at a current level of 41.5. That's down from 52.8 1 year ago, a negative change of something like 21%. Now, in a separate but related stat that was released yesterday from the Congressional Budget Office, the January 2020 to 2030 GDP forecast was marked down by $7.9 trillion, or about 3%. What was incredible about that to me was that GDP isn't expected to catch up to the previously forecasted level until the fourth quarter of 2029. Consumer confidence, well, this chart pretty well says it all. If you look at aviation, which accounts for 5% of GDP in the United States, catastrophic would not be too strong a description for what's occurred in that industry. Where about 45% of aircraft orders are now deemed at risk. And it'll probably be 4.5 years before domestic travel returns to pre-COVID levels. Some are saying as much as 6.5 years for international travel to do the same. But it's not all doom and gloom, and consumer spending is only down about 11% from January. And the jury, of course, is still out when it comes to the impact of some of the stimulus measures. Now, the stock market has staged a rather remarkable comeback. It's only about 12% below its all-time high. And that suggests that with economies reopening, at least investors appear to be expecting an upturn in earnings. Now, after the 2008 crash, economists coined the term a new normal. All of us are now trying to figure out what the post-COVID-19 new normal will look like. One thing's for sure, the coronavirus shock has made the supply chain so much more relevant and so much more prominent in everyone's mind. I want you to check out these Dun & Bradstreet stats. These were shared by Ron Nussel. He's a friend of mine and a highly respected supply chain expert with R.L. Nussel and Associates. Apparently, about 51,000 companies around the world had one or more tier one suppliers in areas that were highly impacted by COVID-19. About 5 million companies around the world had one or more tier two suppliers in impacted areas. In other words, about 94% of Fortune 1000 companies, almost all of them, have suppliers in highly impacted areas. Now, what's remarkable is that for most of these companies, end-to-end supply chain visibility was nearly non-existent. Now, recently, John Chambers, who once led Cisco Systems, seemed to suggest that CEOs, especially those caught flat-footed by the coronavirus pandemic, have finally awakened to the importance of supply chain. Many will now be forced by their boards of directors to make fundamental changes to prepare their supply chains for future shocks. Another executive with Korn Ferry, who specializes in procurement, was recently quoted saying that most modern supply chains were built with the sole priorities of first, minimizing costs, and second, maximizing efficiency. But the pandemic has certainly exposed problems with that model. I want you to consider this. Virtually all manufacturing companies or DoD program offices outsource parts. Typically, they've done that to save money or to satisfy product localization requirements. Today, on average, about 60 to 80% of the parts and assemblies that go into manufactured products of any kind are not manufactured by the original equipment manufacturer or by the DoD program office at the top of that food chain. They're purchased. So in a way, Nissan doesn't make cars, Airbus doesn't make airplanes, and Whirlpool doesn't make washing machines. They're tier one through tier N suppliers do. Now, sure, the OEM designs and assembles the finished product, but the parts are often turned, milled, drilled, bent, or stamped somewhere else, often halfway around the world. Now, about 70% of the time, the material inputs that go into those parts, and we're talking about things like metals, plastics, or electronic components, well, they're purchased through multiple distributors. In turn, those distributors buy from whatever qualified mill sources or component manufacturers they choose. Now, an unintended consequence of all of that outsourcing is that material inputs, things like castings, forgings, bar, sheet, plate, chemicals, plastics, and resins, electronic components, fasteners, bearings, and connectors, all that stuff's purchased not collaboratively, not with OEM oversight, but independently by lots of outside contract manufacturers, and typically in small, suboptimized quantities. This adds immensely to the complexity of the problem. Of course, unbeknownst to most CEOs is the fact that the majority of the cost of machined and fabricated parts are the materials that go into them. In other words, the majority of cost has nothing to do with the outside supplier's labor rates, overheads, or machine speeds and feeds. 30 to 60% of the cost of the parts and the products they go into, whether we're talking about hospital beds, forklifts, aircraft engines, automobiles, missiles, hard drives, or air conditioning systems, 30 to 60% of the cost of the parts that go into those products are the material inputs. And of course, as COVID-19 has amply demonstrated, when it comes to ventilator components or the materials required to produce PPE, raw materials and component parts are as much a point of failure as the products and equipment that they go into. Of course, what you no longer see, you can't control. Now, because most supply chains look like this, if something goes wrong, the manufacturing companies, the depots, or the program offices at the top of the food chain find themselves unable to get critical parts or material inputs. Now, in a post-COVID world, two new supply chain priorities have emerged, namely the ability to minimize not just cost, but multi-tier disruptions. And not just the ability to maximize efficiency within the four walls of your own factory, but to maximize collaboration across an extended enterprise and traceability. Now, supply chains are going to be reimagined as a result of everything we've experienced through COVID-19, and companies will need more than people who understand these complexities. They're going to need to understand what kinds of solutions can be used to take the place of what's traditionally been used to solve them. I mean, spreadsheets are not a way to go about that. That's what this series of workshops is about. Now that we understand the problem, let's talk about the solution. So Winston Churchill famously said, "Never waste a good crisis." Well, in times like these, great companies play defense and offense. De-risking a supply chain through better end-to-end supply chain is one way to do both simultaneously. Now, the first step to doing so is to get good data. And by good data, I mean that you have to understand as much about the parts you buy as the parts you make. And a foundational step in unlocking hidden value in your supply chain is understanding part attributes and part provenance, or the chain of custody of those parts. Now, here's an example of what I'm talking about. Now, anyone that spent more than a year or two in supply chain understands getting your hands on good structured data for parts made by outside suppliers is easier said than done. And by structured data, what I mean is you need bills of materials that subscribe to a uniform naming convention and data taxonomy. I suppose you could ask your suppliers to give you that data, but I think we all know what the likely answer would be. Probably be a resounding no. For companies that don't have reliable bills of materials, we have discovered that the fastest, most accurate, and inexpensive way to get them is to use a process that we call part attribute characterization. Now, this is a process that's used to document all of the attributes of your part, using your engineering drawings as a starting point. Now, the approach only works for those parts and products where a company owns design authority. But let me tell you, it's far better than asking hundreds of outside suppliers to manually self-report that data. And let's face it, most of them wouldn't do it anyway. All right, so let's quickly summarize the first step in addressing multi-tier supply chain challenges. It begins with understanding your parts, how they're made, and all of the material inputs that go into them. Part attribute characterization, which we'll talk about more next time, is the best way to go about that. It also requires you to understand the provenance or chain of custody of all of the part materials and components that go into them. In other words, your tier 1 through your tier N suppliers. Now, while most manufacturing companies or DoD program offices have no trouble identifying their tier 1 supply base, anything below the tier 1 is generally a bit of a black box. Step 2 will help you with that. Step 2 in solving multi-tier supply chain challenges is to leverage good data that you obtained in step 1. And this is where a secure, web-based multi-enterprise platform is essential. Now, you'll notice that I didn't say Excel spreadsheet, and you shouldn't confuse a multi-enterprise platform with an ERP or PLM solution. The ideal multi-enterprise platform solution, and there are several, by the way, it will not require a company to change its existing ERP, PLM, or legacy IT systems. And while it will interface seamlessly with whatever existing IT systems a company or a program office already has in place, it's not going to require anyone to get behind your firewall. Today, most companies have an existing MRP, ERP, or PLM system, and these are usually expensive, very sophisticated systems that do a fairly good job of helping an OEM or a DoD program office see and understand high-level tier 1 part demand and the parts and materials manufactured in their own factories. What most companies lack is an effective multi-enterprise platform, typically web-based, that helps them understand everything below the waterline in this diagram. Multi-enterprise platform helps you answer questions like these. Who are my tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 suppliers? Where are they located? What raw materials go into my parts? Have my parts suppliers purchased that long lead time fastener or forging or electronic component that they need so that parts aren't late to me 6, 12, or 18 months from now? What are the lead times at each node in the supply chain? What distributors, mills, forgers, casting houses, or electronic manufacturers are my sub-tier suppliers purchasing from? And what prices are they paying? Now, let me explain how a multi-enterprise platform works. By the way, I'm somewhat partial to our own, so I'm going to use SDX as the example. Now, assuming that part attribute characterization has revealed the bills of materials for each part or assembly that goes into a manufacturing company's product, that data is simply loaded into the web-based multi-enterprise platform, in this case, SDX. In the meantime, the manufacturing company's ERP solution continues to do what it has always done. It generates a master production schedule for parts so that the manufacturing company can tell its suppliers what part numbers are required, on what calendar dates, and what quantities and from whom. The only difference is that a carbon copy of the master production schedule is simultaneously loaded into the multi-enterprise platform. The multi-enterprise platform, in this case SDX, then translates part and assembly demand into a forecast of material inputs over time. This leading indicator of demand can then be shared with parts suppliers and the distributors and/or mills or manufacturers that the OEM has selected to furnish consolidated material input requirements. That kind of information is the Holy Grail for mills, distributors, casting or forging houses, or even someone like a distributor or manufacturer of electronic components. Why? Well, because today most of them have no idea what forecasted, let alone actual demand is for material across a manufacturing company's extended supply chain. And that creates an enormous amount of risk and inefficiency. Now, in next week's workshop, we're going to talk more about the incentives used to entice stakeholders in a multi-tier supply chain to be more transparent. For now, suffice it to say that the willingness of supply chain stakeholders to be transparent is as much a function of the information you share with them as it is the business volume you award them. The items listed on this slide are indicative of some of the incentives I'm talking about. And as I said earlier, this will receive more treatment in the next workshop. Now, to summarize the second step in addressing multi-tier supply chain challenges, multi-enterprise platforms are the best way to eliminate data gaps that put a supply network at risk. Importantly, they also provide a means of keeping bills of materials up to date and accurate over time, even in an environment where new parts are being added, existing parts are being redesigned, and parts are being transitioned from one supplier to another. Now, with the maturity of multi-enterprise platforms, manufacturing companies are ditching their spreadsheets and increasingly adopting better ways to collaborate with outside part suppliers on the purchase of common material inputs. The arrangement is called a directed buy program, and this is where a large manufacturing company works collaboratively with its outside part suppliers to forecast and manage the consolidated purchasing of common material inputs from certain sources of supply. Mills, distributors, forging and casting houses, or sources of plastics, electronics, and chemicals then become true supply chain partners, anticipating and reacting to forecasted changes in demand weeks and months in advance. Now, the benefits of a directed buy program have been impressive. they eclipse what many other supply chain transformation initiatives can deliver. Now, outside of better track and trace capabilities for parts and materials, the following value streams are pretty typical. Simply by convincing multiple part suppliers to procure same or similar material inputs from common sources of supply, OEMs can typically save from 3 to 7%, in some cases as much as 22%, depending on the commodity. OEMs are also using greater part and supplier visibility to standardize the material sizes and specifications that go into their parts. And this greatly reduces the number of unique SKUs that need to be inventoried, and it will often achieve an additional 5 to 10% savings as mill minimum discounts are achieved. Now, better forecasting and tracking of scrap or nesting of blanks across multiple parties, that can yield another 5 to 7% savings. Some customers use some customers use multi-enterprise platforms primarily to understand and then hedge the chemical elements of the materials used across their supply base. So there's some additional efficiency there as well. Perhaps the most impressive benefit that we have seen have been those related to continuity of supply. This is the simple fact that materials and components are never the reason parts are late to an OEM. In one instance, we witnessed lead times for certain material inputs used by an industrial gas turbine customer shrink by something like 50%. All right. Of course, there are other important but less obvious use cases, and these include ad hoc reporting of forecasts, assembling smart RFQs that map part attributes to supplier capabilities, development of part and assembly should cost models, the ability to detect and quantify counterfeit risks, tracking REACH and RoHS compliance, detecting and reporting on suppliers that have been impacted by natural disasters or pandemics, assessing production readiness when there is a disruption, benchmarking material inputs so that you can understand how a price paid stacks up to the prices being paid by thousands of other buyers. And finally, mapping manufacturing capabilities globally. Hopefully, this brief high-level overview or blueprint of how companies are tackling multi-tier supply chain challenges has been helpful. Now, in our workshop on June 9th and on the 16th, we're going to dig into a lot more detail. We've just sort of covered the high-level overview today. We're going to talk about stakeholder alignment. In other words, how do you get Tier 1 through Tier N suppliers to play ball with or without a directed buy program? We'll also dive into more detail about how a multi-enterprise platform is used to uncover hidden layers of a supply chain and how to keep data up to date and accurate over time through what we call the bill of material validation process. We're also going to touch on program monitoring and enforcement techniques, how program benefits are distributed between supply chain stakeholders. And we're going to talk about the most common sourcing models that are used to implement a directed buy program if that's something you'd like to explore. And so there's much more to come. We hope you've enjoyed this. In what's left of our time, I'm certainly happy to field any questions you may have, either through the chat feature or as Jared opens the microphone.
All right, yeah, we did receive a couple of questions here. So here's one. Do you find that your clients/customers appreciate the concept of cost avoidance? My experience has been that management does not recognize cost avoidance. It's only definitive cost savings that they appreciate.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. It's unfortunate that things like cycle time reduction, inventory reduction, generally aren't considered as seriously as a hard cost PO to PO cost reduction. But I will tell you, again, I think COVID-19 has shined a bright spotlight on the importance of some of the softer savings. One of those would be simply, visibility and the ability to track and trace where suppliers are located, what's their production readiness status. So I would say that yes, in the past, I would say hard savings received all of the attention, but I think soft savings, the likes of which have been exposed by COVID-19, are going to figure more prominently into people's decision making in the future.
I think we have time for one more question here. How long does implementing a multi-enterprise platform take?
So it might surprise you to hear this, but typically, from the time you load a bill of material into a multi-enterprise platform, like the one that we license, SDX, you're probably talking about 48 hours till you're up and running. That surprises most people. Now the devil's in the details. So getting that bill of material can take some time. If you use part attribute characterization to do it, you can greatly reduce the amount of time it takes to get up and running. We typically process somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 parts a week to get bills of materials loaded into SDX. And the validation process for sub-tier suppliers can take some time. Typically, when we invite external stakeholders in a supply chain to log into SDX and view and validate bills of materials, you're talking about 4 to 6 weeks to complete the validation process.
All right, well, I want to thank Mr. Stansbury for that presentation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The second webinar will be taking place on June 9th, and it's called The Game Plan Strategies. It's the same time next week. So thank you all, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day.